If you're a regular listener of Classic 107, you've likely heard the music of Norwegian composer Agathe Backer Grøndahl. As the station's music director, I love programming her works, not only to highlight the charm, delicacy, and virtuosity of her piano music, but also to show that Norwegian classical music extends beyond the familiar names of Grieg, Halvorsen Svensson, and Ole Bull. The pianist bringing these delightful miniatures to life on the air is the fabulous Norwegian musician Sara Aimée Smiseth. With March being Women's History Month and me being such a fan of Bakker Grøndahl's music, I decided to take a chance and reach out to Smiseth, hoping she might have time to chat about this remarkable composer. And to my delight, she's enthusiastically agreed. For those unfamiliar with Agathe Backer Grøndahl, she was a trailblazer, a pianist, composer, and one of Norway's most celebrated musical figures of the 19th century. Hailed by George Bernard Shaw as one of the greatest virtuosos of her time, she balanced an international performing career with composing over 400 works, many of which remain hidden gems in the classical repertoire. Enter Sara Aimée Smiseth, a pianist with a passion for uncovering music's untold stories. With her debut solo album, she shines a spotlight on Bakker Grøndahl's compositions, revealing their poetic depth, technical brilliance, and forward-thinking impressionism. Known for her unique fusion of storytelling and virtuosity, Smiseth is bringing new life to a composer whose legacy deserves a greater recognition. And joining me here over Zoom, it is my pleasure to be joined by the pianist, Sara Aimée Smiseth. Hi, Sarah. Great to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Mhm. So I guess the first place to start, and the most obvious place to start is, how did you get into the music of Agathe Backer Grøndahl? How did you find out about her, and what made you start wanting to record her piano pieces?
Yeah, I think it's I've always since I became a music student when I started at the Norwegian Academy of Music in Oslo, I think I discovered my inner music history nerd.
Mhm.
Chances are there are a few of you listening perhaps today and kind of wanting to I discovered quite early that I liked trying to discover more of the repertoire. When you're a classical pianist, the repertoire is so vast and yet it's quite limited, I would say, if you look at, what sonatas are being performed around the world by the most famous pianists. And I remember I like going to the library and finding new music. And I also remember this name, Agathe Backer Grøndahl, kept coming up. And I think she's sort of like the Clara Schumann of the general musical world. She's that one female composer that you heard of, and then a lot of us don't always know that much more about them. So she kept coming up, Agathe Backer Grøndahl, and I had this image of her as a pianist that composed a few songs and a few smaller classical pieces for piano. And I didn't really know that much about her. So I think my image of her was basically what we think of a lot of the female composers of the 19th century, um, before we get to know them more, that they were not that public and they were not that out there and touring and so on. And then it was actually during COVID that I had to change a lot of the scheduled concerts and recitals that I had. And I decided I really want to have a look into this person that kept coming up. And I discovered that in 2008, there was a Norwegian music researcher called Camilla Hambro. Unfortunately, she just passed away, actually. That was very sad, but 58
Mhm.
years old. But she wrote her PhD thesis on Agatha Backer Grøndahl. So there was a big research. She had done so much work. So I knew that I had a lot of good sources to find out things about her, and that's why how I decided to kind of get into that. Yeah.
Mhm. Can you
Mm.
talk about her as a musician? My understanding is she was friendly with the Griegs, and she was a student of Liszt. Is that right?
Yeah, it is actually. I'm fascinated why, especially that she was a student of Liszt for a whole summer. A lot of Norwegian musicians don't know about that, and I think it's strange because it's such a big
Yeah.
uh, kind of a big deal. But yeah, with actually with her sisters, she traveled out in Europe, like many of the people of the, I would say, upper middle class did when they were young. But it was quite uncommon, I would say, that two young women traveled out together, her and her sister, Harriet Backer, who later became a famous painter, actually. So they were two of the sisters became quite
Mm,
famous. And then Agatha Backer Grøndahl was really good at networking. So she knew she had some teachers in Berlin when she was a student there, and she would get their recommendations and then use them to get in touch with new musicians. And that's how she when she came to Weimar in Germany to meet with Liszt, that city was full of young and more or less promising other pianists that wanted to meet him. But she had recommendations from people in Copenhagen and Sweden and Germany, and could just she could meet him with him directly,
mm,
and spend the whole summer with him as a student. So
mhm.
yeah.
And can you talk about her personal life? Like, as you've alluded to, she was, I think, the second youngest of four sisters. Like, what kind of a family life did she have? And the other thing I was wondering about when I was prepping the interview was when you were reading about her, did you come across any instances where she talked about juggling this busy life of being a mother, being married, and having and concertizing? Like, what was her personal
Mm.
life like?
Yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating. She in because I think Clara Schumann, for example, she was, I think that for every child that I mean, she was less and less interested, is my impression of family life. Like Clara Schumann was more. I think they were quite different. Just to compare, is typical because it's the two female composers that a lot of people have
Mm,
heard about. But I mean, Agatha Backer Grøndahl was actually quite. She loved her family very much, I think, and she did, in fact. I don't think she saw it as a conflict in the same way Clara Schumann did, that she had a career and she was a mother and a family person. So she was quite close with all the sisters as well. And I think it's interesting to see that in many cases she herself build this image that I was talking about, that she was a mother and she liked to stay at home. I read an interview where she talks about how she loves, watering her plants, house plants. Like that's the kind of image that she built, but that image also allowed her to be accepted as a typical female person, woman of the 19th
mm,
century, which then again meant that she could also go out and have a career without people noticing that too much in a negative way, in a sort of sense. So I think
mm.
she actually was quite smart in the way she built her public image, because it actually allowed her to have a more freedom as a composer and a pianist as well, I think.
So she was thought of as a domestic homebody, but also somebody who could perform on the concert stage, right?
Mhm.
Hmm, hmm,
Yeah, and I think also the fact that she had three sons, and the fact that she was a mother meant that she was probably a little less abroad than many of her male colleagues. But I found out that that made her, she was touring a lot more in Norway. And I
hmm,
think in many cases that meant that she had a much closer relationship with the Norwegian public and the Norwegian concert audience, because she was a lot more in Norway touring
hmm,
than Regan and many of the other ones that were more abroad.
hmm.
And she also got the chance to collect a lot of folk music in Norway, which is not very well known. And so it is some interesting aspects. It's not only negative sides to, to having a family,
Hmm,
which I think is interesting to see. Yeah.
hmm. And one of the things that struck me about your CD is that influence of Norwegian folk music. And it's interesting. I hear it throughout the disc, but in particular with the Norwegian dances, there are little miniatures that are very reminiscent of the Hardanger fiddle, the traditional Norwegian Swedish fiddle. Can you talk a little bit about how she integrated these Norwegian folk influences into her piano writing?
Yeah. I think we're also in a time where Norway was under the rule of Sweden, and we are kind of trying to get our independence and building a national identity for ourselves. And so music was a big part of that. And I remember when I was a student at the musicology department at the University of Oslo, one of my lecturers, he actually said that she wasn't interested in Norwegian folk music. And I think he just didn't know about it, that she both that she collected folk music from actual folk musicians in the environment where the music had been passed down from generation to generation, and that she made these arrangements. And I think there are some interesting differences from Grieg's way of arranging folk music. And I think it's a really great contribution. And it's a little sad, I think, that not many Norwegians know her folk music arrangements that well, but that's why I also thought it was important to record some of it, and especially the music for the Hardanger fiddle, which is very typical Norwegian. So yeah.
It's just great. Um, the disc was released in 2022 and it consists of miniatures. These idylls, the Norwegian folk dances, etc. Did she write any like larger, more substantial compositions aside from her songs that she was known for?
Yeah, she did. I have in the later, the past few years, I have performed some of her. She has a whole suite, which is sort of inspired by the 17th century, kind of Baroque inspired. And then
Mm,
she also has this another suite, which is a fairy tale suite, she calls it. I have one track on the CD from that work, in the Blue Mountains. And that's a really great piece of work that was, it's about 20 minutes long, and it's just, um, it's really, yeah, I really like that work. And she has a lot of concert etudes that are also quite a little larger in
mm,
and then she did compose a cantata, a small cantata for choir and soloist and piano. She did also write a few orchestral pieces when she was a student. But I've been also thinking she didn't write any sonatas, for example, but I have discovered in the past couple of years that she did arrange a lot of music or a lot of her own music for different ensembles, small
mm,
orchestras for chamber music. So I've started to look into some of the manuscripts that are at the National Library here in Oslo and found some really interesting things. So it's actually her own arrangements of her own music. So
mm.
I'm sure there are some gems there to be discovered and performed.
Great. One of the other things I noticed about the CD is, especially in the Idylls, they reminded me actually a lot of Grieg's lyric pieces. She was friendly with the Griegs. Do you think she was influenced by Grieg, or was Grieg influenced by her? Like, wait, can you talk about that a little bit? What were
Yeah,
the
sure.
influences?
Yeah, I mean, they were Grieg was 4 years older, I think, than her, so they were quite, and they almost, I would say, grew up together as colleagues. In They both lived in Oslo for a time. Grieg was from the west coast of Norway, from Bergen, but they did spend a lot of time together when they were younger. Also, Agathe Backer Grøndahl's very first opus was a set of songs that was premiered by her and Nina Grieg. So that
Ah,
she was a singer, so there's a connection with Nina Rigg as well. And I know that Grieg probably was more famous in Europe than she was. Grieg was more of a public person in the rest of Europe in her time, at least
mm,
for yeah, I would say that that's fair. So or that's but at the same time, they would send each other their compositions. Uh, I, I mean, she's speaking very respectfully to Grieg and always uses his last name and so forth. But there was also a very deep friendship there. So later, when she was having some difficulties and she couldn't work, Edvard Grieg is writing these really touching letters that encourages her. And I think they were her, and they were quite close. So I would probably they influenced each other in a lot of ways.
mm,
Uh, Even though Grieg is probably more well known today, of course.
mm.
And I would love to learn more about it. I haven't read all of the letters between them, for example. So there's still more to discover, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, I'm going to butcher the name of this piece. Bear with me. You describe her piece. Help me out here. I Blafayette.
Ah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
uh,
That's in
uh,
the Blue Mountains, or that was
okay,
the one talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you describe it as sort of impressionistic. Can you talk about that? And does her later music show influence of the impressionist style, or like, can you talk about her later piano music?
Mm. Yeah, and it's not just me that's saying that. I heard other musical historians also say that. But she did. I mean, she did travel and she did go to France, but then I think also through her sister, the painter Harriet Bucker, she lived in Paris for a long time and did
Mm,
was also slightly influenced by French impressionism in some ways in her paintings, her sister. So I think there's something there, and also I think it's in some ways Agathe Backer Grøndahl's music is to me sounds more European than some of Edvard Grieg's music, which sound more Norwegian. Um, I think that's yeah. And so I'm not sure where the influence is coming from, but I would say that she was quite well oriented towards Europe, and she did have some great performances in Paris as a soloist there with orchestras and things. So I think it's interesting to see that she did change her music when she got older, and I think there are some influences from maybe France and maybe some influences of Liszt, her old teacher, and
mhm. Yeah. Um, Listening to the disc, her music really does run the gamut of moods and pianistic colors. Thinking back to when you recorded the disc, what was the most challenging thing about trying to get those colors and moods across on the recording?
Hmm. Yeah, I think I remember it was during COVID, so it was a strange time too. But I think it's there are some very subtle nuances in a lot of the music, and I think it's almost more of a challenge in this sort of in the simpler pieces to get those nuances across. And the more I perform them, of course, the more I kind of discover and
Mm.
um, in many ways, I wish I could record the entire CD one more time because now I've played the pieces so much more. You know, I said, oh, I now I want to emphasize this more, and but I think that's it's always like that when you do a CD. I think but I think I am more and more fascinated by the this her more lyric or not lyric pieces, character pieces in a way. And in the beginning, I was a little bit afraid to. I didn't want to present her as I was talking about the image that I had of her, of this composer that only who only composes these sort of smaller pieces. But that's also, even though she had some great other suites and bigger works too, she's really a specialist, I would say, in those character pieces and
Mm.
creating those moods and sounds. So yeah, I keep discovering new things about them, and I think there's so much great music that she has written, and I do also hope if there are any pianists listening who haven't played her music, it's everything is to find, I think, on the IMSLP
Mm.
website. All of her music is there for free, so have a look into it and yeah, give it a go.
Yeah. Aside from being a great pianist, you're also a musicologist. You hold a Bachelor of Musicology from the University of Oslo. I understand soon, very soon, you're going to be giving a lecture concert on Agatha Backer Grøndahl and her sisters. How do you incorporate her music into the lecture? Like, how does that, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's I think I discovered this when I had a job a few summers in a musical museum in Norway, a place called Ringve Museum, where it's lots of old piano instruments and you demonstrate the pianos and then you talk about music history. And I discovered how this combination of playing and talking, you can really the storytelling can affect how people listen to the music, and the music can affect how you hear the storytelling.
Mhm.
Um, so that's something especially when I'm working with this, I think it's really interesting to combine this creating good stories to tell, but it's all based in facts and music history. So again, the music history nerd in me is really really loves creating these lecture concerts where I get to talk about very often lesser known people of music history and also showing this music. And I think I mean, it's easier in a way for people to hear music that you haven't heard before when you have a context and you know more about the person. And yeah, so I always love the process of creating a brand new concert. Mm.
Hmm. Hmm. Uh, what was the most rewarding thing for you recording this C? Was it just the idea of getting Agathe Backer Grøndal's music out into the world?
Yeah, I think that was very important to me, of course, to because I love this music so much myself, so I wanted more people to hear it. And then it was also, I think it was nice this was my debut album. I still haven't created a full CD after that, so it's still my full CD, only full CD recording. I hope to get some more out, but I'm kind of proud that that composer is actually my debut album because it's yeah, I kind of proudly present her music, and I'm always happy to travel around with it and meet people and hear that people still love her music just like they did back in the 19th century.
Hmm.
So I'm very happy that that's my debut album actually, if I can
Hmm.
say that.
And so
Mm.
you've been playing this music around the world. How has it been received by international audiences?
Yeah, I think I'm almost surprised, I would say, of how positive people are, and again, I think it sort of helps that I present it together with the story of her life, and but I think it's also interesting to see that some of the pieces that were most popular in her time are still the pieces that people today like. For example, the Serenade, which is on the CD. And in the Blue Mountains, i Blåfjellet, the sweet fairy
Mhm.
tale suite that I was talking about. So I'm very happy to see that they still like the music, and she's not so well known because her music is there's anything wrong with it. It's
Yeah,
just other coincidences that makes her name not less
yeah.
familiar to people. Yeah.
It- It's been
Mm.
neglected, and it's too bad because
Right.
it's fabulous stuff. Sarah, this has been a real treat for me. I'm so glad we could finally make this chat happen and sit down and talk about her music. Thanks for taking the time to talk about Agathe Backer Grøndahl with me. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for playing my CD so much on your radio station. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.